Right now, somewhere in the world, a dog is lying on a couch staring at absolutely nothing, and if you asked its owner what the dog was thinking about, they'd probably laugh and say, nothing, maybe food, maybe squirrels. But what if that's completely wrong? What if behind those eyes, there's actually someone looking back, a mind that doesn't just see the room around it, but somehow understands that it is the one seeing it? What if that dog remembers yesterday, expects tomorrow, recognizes the people it loves, misses them when they're gone, and understands on some level that those experiences are happening to itself? In other words, what if your dog actually knows that it exists? And here's the stranger possibility. What if it doesn't? What if it can dream, feel pain, remember places, recognize your face, and get excited when you return without ever having anything resembling the thought, I am alive? That's the mystery scientists have been trying to solve for decades, and there's one enormous problem. We can't simply ask, so scientists had to find another way into the animal mind. And one of the most famous attempts began in 1970 when psychologist Gordon Gallup Jr. introduced the mirror test. The idea was simple. Researchers place a visible mark somewhere on an animal's body where it can't normally see it, then give the animal access to a mirror and watch what happens. Many animals behave as if they've encountered another creature. A dog might bark, a monkey might threaten the reflection, or another animal might search behind the mirror before eventually losing interest. But occasionally something very different happens. The animal notices the mark in the reflection, and instead of reaching toward the mirror, it reaches toward its own body. That tiny movement matters because it suggests the animal has connected the reflection with itself. Some great apes have demonstrated this behavior, while dolphins, elephants, and certain birds have also shown evidence of mirror self-recognition. At first, that sounds like strong evidence of self-awareness, until you look at the animals that usually fail. Dogs, cats, and many other mammals fail, and even human children don't reliably recognize themselves in mirrors from birth. So either self-awareness is incredibly rare, or the test itself is missing something. The problem is that the mirror test assumes vision matters to every animal as much as it matters to humans. We recognize ourselves largely by appearance, but dogs experience the world very differently. Much of their reality is built through smell, and their noses can detect information that humans barely realize exists. Testing a dog's self-awareness with a mirror might therefore be like testing yours by asking you to identify yourself only by smell. Failing wouldn't necessarily mean you don't know who you are, it might simply mean the test was designed for the wrong kind of mind. That's why researchers tried a different approach. Instead of asking whether dogs recognized their faces, they tested whether they recognized their own smell. When presented with their own scent and modified versions of it, dogs often spent longer investigating the altered scent. Something familiar had changed, and they appeared to notice. That doesn't prove a dog thinks, that's me, but it suggests an animal's sense of self may look very different from ours. And this leads to a deeper question, because recognizing your own body isn't necessarily the same thing as understanding your own mind. Think about what your brain is doing right now. You're listening to these words, but you can also notice that you're listening. You can realize you're confused, notice you've stopped paying attention, know you've forgotten something, or feel confident that you remember something correctly. Your mind can monitor itself. Scientists call this metacognition, the ability to think about your own thinking, to know what you know and recognize when you don't know something. For a long time, this seemed like exactly the kind of ability that should separate humans from every other animal. Then scientists started testing animals, and that distinction became much harder to defend. One of the most revealing experiments involved rhesus monkeys. Researchers gave them memory tests, but also gave them a choice. They could take a difficult test for a larger reward, or choose an easier option for a smaller reward. When the monkeys seemed confident, they chose the difficult option more often, but when they were uncertain, they usually avoided the risk. That suggests the monkeys weren't simply remembering information, they appeared to be judging how reliable their own memory was before making a decision. Signs of the same ability have appeared in other animals. Rats sometimes skip difficult tests and accept smaller guaranteed rewards when they're uncertain. Pigeons have shown behaviors suggesting they can distinguish between what they remember and what they may have forgotten, while dolphins sometimes hesitate when faced with difficult decisions. Different species with very different brains keep showing the same strange pattern. Some animals don't seem to be blindly reacting to information, they appear to keep track of how certain they are about it. That doesn't mean they're questioning the meaning of existence, but it suggests their brains may be monitoring their own internal states. But this brings us to a much bigger problem, because everything we've discovered so far comes from behavior. We can watch a monkey make a decision, see a rat avoid a difficult test, or observe a dog investigating its altered scent, but we're still only seeing what happens on the outside. We have no direct access to what any of it feels like on the inside. Imagine a machine sophisticated enough to scream when damaged, pull away from danger, remember what caused the damage, and avoid it in the future. From the outside, it might look exactly like pain, but would it actually be experiencing pain, or simply processing information and producing the correct response? This is where the scientific question becomes a philosophical one. There's a difference between detecting pain and feeling pain, just as there's a difference between processing red light and actually experiencing what red looks like. Philosophers sometimes use the word qualia for this raw subjective quality of experience, the actual feeling of pain, color, fear, pleasure, or simply being you. The strange part is that you can't directly prove anyone else experiences the world the same way you do. You assume other humans are conscious because they behave like you, communicate like you, and have brains similar to yours, but you can never actually enter another person's consciousness. With animals, the problem becomes even harder because they can't describe their inner experience. A dog can't explain what your scent feels like to recognize. A dolphin can't describe what moving through the ocean feels like, and a bird can't tell you what the world feels like from high above the ground. We can study their brains and behavior, but their subjective world remains hidden. So is there actually something it feels like to be a dog? When your dog hears your key in the door and runs toward you, is there a conscious experience of excitement happening inside? When a wolf looks across a snowy landscape, is there a point of view behind those eyes? Or could an animal process information, remember events, and react appropriately without experiencing any of it the way we do? In 1974, philosopher Thomas Nagel explored this problem with a famous question: what is it like to be a bat? He chose bats because their experience of reality is radically different from ours. Many bats navigate using echolocation, producing sounds and interpreting returning echoes to understand distance, movement, shape, and location. We can study the physics of echolocation, examine a bat's nervous system, map activity in its brain, and even build machines using similar principles, but none of that tells us what echolocation actually feels like to a bat. You can imagine navigating through sound, but you're still imagining it with a human brain. You don't know what being a bat feels like, only what being a human imagining a bat feels like. That's the wall science keeps running into. We can learn an enormous amount about what an animal does without gaining direct access to what it experiences, but not being able to enter another mind doesn't mean there's nothing happening inside it. As neuroscientists compared human brains with those of other species, the idea that consciousness belongs only to us became increasingly difficult to defend. Many biological systems associated with awareness already exist in other mammals, birds, and possibly animals whose evolutionary paths separated from ours hundreds of millions of years ago. Maybe consciousness isn't an all-or-nothing switch that humans have and every other creature lacks. Maybe it developed gradually and took different forms as different nervous systems evolved. If that's true, asking whether animals are conscious may be the wrong question. The more interesting question is how many different ways there are to experience being alive. That possibility became harder to ignore in 2012, when neuroscientists gathered at the University of Cambridge to discuss what decades of research had revealed about animal consciousness. Their conclusion was striking. Many neurological systems associated with conscious experience in humans also exist in other mammals and birds. This became known as the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness, and it challenged the idea that humans are alone in having an inner experience. Animal brains don't need to look like ours to produce complex minds. Some birds can solve difficult problems, recognize individuals, use tools, and plan ahead. Octopuses are even stranger. Their evolutionary path separated from ours hundreds of millions of years ago, and much of their nervous system is distributed through their arms, yet they solve puzzles, remember solutions, escape enclosures, and show distinct individual behaviors. Maybe our mistake has been searching for human consciousness in non-human animals. A dolphin doesn't need a human mind to have a mind, and a dog doesn't need to recognize its face in a mirror to possess some awareness of itself. Primatologist Franz de Waal spent decades challenging the idea that complex inner lives suddenly appeared with humans. Evolution usually modifies what already exists. Memory, fear, attachment, communication, and social behavior all developed gradually, so consciousness may have followed the same path. Instead of being a switch that's either on or off, awareness may exist across a spectrum, from basic experiences like pain and fear to memory, planning, uncertainty, social understanding, and some sense of self. But perhaps the strongest evidence doesn't come from intelligence at all. It comes from emotion, especially grief. In 2018, a killer whale known as Tahlequah gave birth to a calf that died shortly after birth. There was no obvious survival benefit to carrying the body, yet she refused to leave it. She kept the calf near the surface, pushing it with her head and diving down whenever it slipped away. She continued for 17 days while traveling roughly 1,000 miles with her pod. Whatever was happening inside Tahlequah's mind, her calf was gone, and that loss seemed to matter to her. Similar behavior has been observed in other animals. Elephants have returned to the remains of dead members of their groups, while chimpanzee mothers have carried dead infants for extended periods. None of this proves their grief feels exactly like ours, but it suggests they can recognize when someone who was once present is suddenly gone. That requires memory, attachment, expectation, and an awareness that something important has changed. So now we can return to the question we started with. Does the dog lying on the couch know it's alive? Science still can't give us a simple answer. We know some animals recognize aspects of themselves, some appear capable of monitoring their own uncertainty, and many possess complex memories, emotions, relationships, and neurological systems associated with consciousness. What we can't access directly is what any of that feels like inside their minds. Still, something keeps happening whenever humans draw a boundary between ourselves and other animals. Another species crosses it. Tool use was considered uniquely human until chimpanzees were observed making tools. Complex problem-solving seemed uniquely ours until crows began solving multi-step puzzles. Culture, mourning, planning, and forms of self-recognition have all appeared outside our species. Again and again, we draw a line between us and them, and research makes that line less clear. Maybe we've been expecting consciousness to reveal itself in a human way. A dog may never look into a mirror and think, "That's me," and it may never wonder why it exists, but that doesn't mean there's nobody behind its eyes. Think again about that dog on the couch. It recognizes familiar voices, remembers smells, predicts what happens next, forms attachments, and experiences emotions. Whether it ever thinks, "I am alive," may be impossible to prove, but consciousness may not require words. Maybe knowing you exist begins with something simpler: recognizing who you trust, knowing when you're uncertain, remembering someone who is gone, and understanding in whatever way your brain allows that the things happening in the world are happening to you. If that's true, humans may not be the only creatures looking out at the universe from somewhere inside a mind. We may simply be the ones who learned how to ask the question,